Hi friends, welcome back to World Maker Books. I'm Joy, and we're going to continue today with readings of Black and White by Mark Wandrey. We're starting at chapter 16 today, so here we go. Chapter 16, PCRI, Molokai, Hawaii, Earth, November 27th, 2036. Terry ate slowly, watching his mother across the table. The turkey had been bought at a local deli, as was the entire meal. She looked tired. More tired than he'd seen her since she'd returned home from the hospital. Doc was sitting next to him, quietly eating, looking out of place. "Thanks again for inviting me, Terry," he said, "and you, Mrs. Clark, for having me." Terry glanced at his mom when Doc called her Miss Clark. She glanced up sharply, then nodded and said he was welcome. It wasn't public knowledge that she'd both refused to put up bail money for Dr. Matthew Clark and also filed for divorce more than a month ago. All anyone in town knew was that Terry's father was still in Seattle and still in jail. Yui, though, of course, knew it all. He'd also invited her to Thanksgiving dinner. She had to stay with her family, though she'd wanted to go with Terry, especially after he'd told her about the divorce. Later, after dinner, they sat in the living room overlooking the cetaceans' tanks. Doc and Terry's mom were drinking wine, and Terry had hot chocolate. Quiet music was playing, and for some reason Terry felt it was awkward, and he didn't know why. It turned out he wasn't the only one, because his mom suddenly said something. "I never thanked you," she said to Doc. "For what?" "You've been a real friend to Terry. He's had so much fun learning to dive. It's all he talks about." Doc smiled and nodded. "Yui and he are great kids. When I caught them bumming around the docks, I felt like I was rescuing a couple of wayward kittens." His mother slowly turned to skewer Terry with a jaundiced stare. Terry smiled and looked down at his hot chocolate. "Bumming around the docks, eh?" "We were looking around, you know." "I'm sure," his mother said, then smiled. She chuckled, and Terry let his breath out. "Mrs. Clark," Doc started. "Madison is fine," she said. Doc smiled and continued. "I don't want to spoil the mood, but can you tell me how the court case is going?" Her mouth thinned, and she looked at Terry. "He means the one to take the cetaceans away," Terry said quickly. "Oh, right," she said, casting another glance at her son. "Well, after the gag order was put in place, the press has been hounding us all pretty badly." "I'm sure," Doc said. "I had one show up at school right before the break. Caught him trying to sneak into the cafeteria. Principal Landau wanted to press charges. We've moved through several motions, and right now both sides are in a discovery phase. I'm not a lawyer, but it involves a lot of questions. The High Court hasn't tried many cases, and they're hesitant to create precedent. There are animal rights groups trying to get the cetaceans, all cetaceans, declared sentient beings with full rights under the Earth Republic Bill of Rights. The World FDA body is trying to get involved, suggesting the pin plants are unlicensed medical devices. Luckily, the court dismissed their claim because the cetaceans aren't people by definition. Unless the animal rights groups win," Doc added. "Yes, there is that. One of the problems we have now is that the religious nutjobs have gotten involved." "The big churches? Like the Pope and stuff?" "No, thankfully. The Vatican has stayed out of it so far. There have been a couple edicts from the usual Middle Eastern sources, of course. I never thought I'd be glad Iran wasn't around anymore." Doc grunted and nodded. He knew only too well. "The problem with the religious types is this faith of the abyss," she said. "The ones based on the Orca's god, Shul?" Terry asked. "Yeah, them. They went from loons to well-funded loons almost overnight." Terry remembered the birth of that. The people who'd show up every day to listen to Cray give a sermon on the God of the Deep, how it had created the world, starting in the oceans, and gone on from there. "But Cray talks about Shul being a unifier," Terry complained. "How Shul wants all creatures on Earth to live together in peace." "The faith of the abyss thinks cracking some skulls might speed things along. They've been protesting outside the courthouse in Sao Paulo, and here most days." She looked outside toward the ocean, almost like she expected to see them rappelling down the side of the Institute. "What about your husband?" She glanced at Terry again, who was stirring his now cold hot chocolate into a froth. "He's still in jail in Seattle. The feds have custody, and those charges are separate." Doc looked at her for a long moment, glanced at Terry, then the empty chair where Terry's father would have sat. After a second, he nodded and finished his glass of wine. "Well, it's been great, Madison," he said. "You're welcome to stay," Madison said. "Plenty of wine." "It's a bit of a drive back to Crispin," he said. She looked confused. "My boat?" "Oh," she said, "you live on it?" "We're good friends," he said, and winked. "It looks like it might rain, too." He got up, and she escorted him to the door. He took her hand and gently shook it. "Thanks for dinner." "You're welcome in our home any time," she said. "See you at school after the break," he said to Terry. "No time for a dive?" "Other work," he said. "Sorry." With a wave, he was out of the apartment and heading for the elevator. Terry turned to his mom as soon as the elevator door closed. "Mom, why couldn't you at least get Dad out of jail?" "His problems are his own." "It's Thanksgiving, Mom." "Yes, I noticed." She limped back and poured herself another glass of wine. Terry made a face, but decided not to continue that line of conversation. He was learning, it seemed. "How long do you think before the court rules?" "The lawyers say it could be as long as a year, or as little as 2 months. The High Court is too new, there's no real precedent, as I said earlier. Our bigger problem is money." "We still have people paying to talk to the bottlenoses and orcas," he said. She nodded. Terry had been instrumental in getting her to allow the encounters. The interest was many times higher even than when his father had charged for encounters. However, Terry had argued the chances for the cetaceans to meet and talk with people was good for them, and they'd agreed when Madison had asked them. Eventually, Dr. Hernandez and Dr. Patel had also asked her to allow the face-to-face meetings to continue, and for the Institute to charge a modest amount for it. She contacted the government representatives through her lawyer and explained it to them. Dr. Tamata herself called and said it was permissible as long as the time and number of visitors were kept within reason, so they'd begun again. 3 days a week, on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, for 2 hours. There were lines every day, rain or shine. The bottlenoses were, of course, thrilled. The orcas seemed to enjoy company as well, the wandering pod more so than the shore pod. Terry decided to look for a chance to find out why. He got a chance the next day. The Institute was empty the day after Thanksgiving. Most of the staff were at home, so naturally Terry took the chance to feed all 3 groups. It was the ideal opportunity to catch some private time with the orcas. There was only a single government intermediary on site, and he stayed in the security office, playing with his computer. Nobody gave Terry a second look when he slipped back into the orca encounter area and spotted one of them lazily floating on the surface. It was a female named Moloko, whom he'd seldom spoken to. She had bright white markings that were probably the reason for her name, which meant milk in Russian. He gently slapped the surface, and she looked up at him with a huge eye. "What want?" "How come your pod is so sad?" Terry asked. "People want learn shul." "What people?" Terry asked. "People before." "Before all the changes?" "Yes, before. Now no come." Terry understood now. The attendants who took admission now had digital facial recognition and were instructed to deny entry to a list of people who were members of the Faith of the Abyss, or just FA, as they were often referred to in the press. The group had held a protest outside the Institute only the day before Thanksgiving. "They were bad people," Terry tried to explain. "How bad?" That's not an easy one to explain, Terry thought. "Cray say they want learn shul." Another orca on the surface nearby was looking at him. It was the male named Bick. "Learn shul good." "They're hurting people," Terry said. Cray surfaced right in front of Terry, making him gasp in surprise. Being only centimeters from a 5-ton apex predator was disconcerting, even knowing the orcas had never treated man as prey. "Why they hurt?" asked Cray. "They're desperate to get in here," Terry told him, "to see you." The massive orca shook his head up and down. "They hurt see me?" "Yes," Terry said. He'd been warned more than once about being too truthful with his cetaceans, but they weren't naturally schooled in subterfuge or even misdirection. He wasn't entirely certain they didn't know how to lie. Dr. Orsage was constantly studying that aspect of their personality. "We no want see them," Cray said. "Not see is good." "We agree," Terry said. "Protect moms," Cray said. "Moms?" Terry wondered aloud. "My mom isn't in any danger." "Not your mom. Our soon mom." Terry blinked and looked at the massive orca who slipped part of the way underwater, his pectoral fin slapping the water lazily. "Soon mom," he thought. "Do you mean yours is pregnant?" "I can no be mom," Cray said, his translated words conveying a sense of amusement. Terry felt his cheeks grow hot. "I know you can't be pregnant," Terry said. "Are one of the girls pregnant?" "I be mom," Moloko said. "Oh, shit," Terry said. He got up and ran to the elevator. "Nobody can know about this," his mom said, within minutes of his running into her office with the news. She'd called all the senior staff to tell them. Terry stood aside, surprisingly not chased out of the office, and listened as the adults discussed what to do. "I think it gives weight to the statement of their natural innocence in this," Dr. Patel said. "If we told the investigators—" "If we told them, they might take it the wrong way," she cut the man off. "We can't predict what they would say or do." More of the doctors nodded, then shook their heads. Terry knew how persuasive his mom could be. She got up and limped over to the window overlooking the orca tanks. Several were swimming in lazy circles around a sunbeam, shining in through one of the many skylights. "Have all the cetaceans tested," she said, ASAP. "I'll get right on it," Dr. Janig said. "Assuming none of the others are pregnant, I want them all on pregnancy suppressants." "Do you think that's necessary?" Dr. Orsage asked. "What do you think would be the results of a slew of births with their altered personalities?" "You know I have no clue," the woman replied. "All the more reason to put the brakes on this," she replied, and then looked at them. "I'd like to know why nobody witnessed the mating and how long ago it was." "I can answer that," Dr. Hernandez said. She looked a little surprised that the expert on their bottlenose dolphins was the one to talk. She nodded for him to proceed. "When I got your message, I was within earshot of the bottlenoses, who heard your call. They all knew about it." "How?" she wondered. "I don't know, but they also knew when the pregnancy happened. They gave me a number of days, so on my way down, I ran the recordings back." He handed his slate to her, and she looked at the images. Despite the machine being largely transparent, Terry couldn't see anything on it. The date they gave was precise. "They're talking to each other somehow," she said. "Not possible," Dr. Patel said. "They're never closer than having several meters of concrete between them. The two orcapods possibly, but the orcas and the bottlenoses? Impossible." "Regardless," his mom said, looking down at the display, "this is interesting. Carry out the tests and we'll go from there." After a minute, they all left the office. Only then did she realize Terry was still there. "You've been here the whole time?" He gave a cockeyed smile and she shook her head before smiling herself. "Thank you for bringing me the information." "What was I supposed to do? Keep it quiet?" "Definitely not," she said, and limped over to him. "You know the world government has been talking about convening a tribunal." Terry nodded. "That doesn't mean anything will happen soon, but it does mean they're going to begin deliberating on what should be done." "Are we going to testify, like, in court?" "Only if there's a trial," she said. "The meetings we had with Dr. Tamada were our only chance to talk it out. We're past that now." She sighed, moving over to a chair and slowly lowering herself into it. "The World Court doesn't know what they're doing, so this will take time. In the meantime, we'll just do what we can and hope." That night at dinner, his mom picked up her phone when a message came in. "What's up?" Terry asked. "Dr. Janig has the data on the test." Terry put his fork down and listened. "Only the female resident, Moloko, is pregnant. None of the other orcas or any of the bottlenoses are. Is that good?" "Yes," she said. "They're going over all the camera footage, though, to see how much loving has been going on." Terry laughed and she smiled at him. "Based on the date from our recordings, Moloko is 10 months pregnant. She'll be due between June and August." Terry grinned. A baby orca would be cool. At least it was something to look forward to in the coming months, and would take his mind off of his parents' impending divorce. They ate the rest of their meal in silence, both wrapped in their own thoughts. Part 2. Exodus. Chapter 1. Molokai Middle School, Molokai, Hawaii, Earth, May 31st, 2037. The entire class looked up in alarm as a rattle rolled through Molokai Middle School. Several students yipped in surprise, and one boy gave a little scream. In the following silence, his friends gave the kid a good ribbing. Terry listened and waited with the practice of a longtime resident of the Hawaiian Islands. Earthquakes were sometimes a daily occurrence. A single shutter shock, though? Unusual. It reminded him a little of the brief activity period from Wailau, or the East Molokai volcano, as the tourists called it, 5 years ago. Only in that case, it was a series of intense shocks, not just one. "Everything looks fine," the teacher said, holding up her hands. "Probably just an earthquake." The kids who were native or long-term residents all looked at each other skeptically, probably thinking the same thing as Terry. An hour later at lunch, Terry realized a few kids were missing from his class. His school wasn't large, less than 50 seniors in all, but he wouldn't have noticed a few missing if someone else hadn't mentioned it as he was passing. "Did you see Katrina Long was pulled out?" someone said. "Yeah, Colin, too," another said. "Earthquake fever," Yui said with a smirk as they found their customary table. The friends had only just started to eat when they felt the next tremor. This time, Terry noted a long, low reverberation following the shock. Unlike an earthquake, this one he heard instead of felt through his feet. "What the hell?" he wondered. It was almost like an explosion, only it went on for several seconds before trailing off. The second one was followed by several more over the course of his lunch hour. They seemed almost regular. He'd been trying to have a conversation with Yui about a dive they'd been talking about. Since it was the last day of school, Doc had offered to take them on a celebratory dive the next day. But every time they got into the conversation again, there was another shock and rumble. He looked up and saw several of the teachers by the exit, talking. Now he knew something was up. "Yo, Terry," Ben Stevenson called from the next table over. "What's up?" Terry asked. Ben held up his tablet and waved for Terry to come over. Terry glanced in the direction of the teachers. Using computers during school was against the rules, even during lunch. The adults were in a huddle of conversation, and they had a tablet as well. He glanced at Yui, who nodded, and the two slipped over next to their friend. "Check this out," Ben said, and clicked on the screen, bringing up the web page for a local television station. "This video was shot live by an observer and sent to us at WFFV," a man's voice said. There was a moment of poor camera control, typical of someone shooting with their phone. The view jerked around before suddenly focusing on an unmistakable shot of the PCRI. Terry recognized it instantly. The view was shot from the road above and behind the Institute. For a few seconds, he thought there'd been another protest by the Faith of the Abyss, which happened almost every day. Immediately, his fear evolved to thinking it was a bomb attack or something like that. When the camera swung around to show the main road up to the Institute, it was blocked by a sea of flashing emergency lights. "Oh no," he thought. "What's going on?" Yui asked. "Wait for it," Ben said. A second later, a ship plummeted out of the sky, its engines flashing like stars as they fired. It slowed steadily as it descended. As it slowed to a stop, a thunderous boom rolled across the person filming the events, and the recording jerked all over the place again. "We're hearing sonic booms," said another kid who was watching the video over their shoulders. "How do you know?" another kid asked. They'd apparently drawn a crowd. "My brother's a merc," the kid said. "His outfit's in Houston, and he says ships make those sounds when they come down from orbit." Terry watched the scene intently, trying to will the person filming to refocus on the action. He was about to yell at the tablet when it finally refocused, and he watched a huge ship settle down into the upper parking lot, the one used by staff. Even before the ship began to lower toward the ground, he could see the concrete was blasted black. It hadn't been the first ship to land. "Terry Clark!" He looked up at the authoritative voice. Doc, Mr. Abercrombie at school, was standing with the teachers, waving him over. He immediately walked over to him. Everyone around was watching him. "Yes, Mr. Abercrombie?" He was terrified. "Your mother said to take you to the Institute immediately," he said. "What's going on?" Terry hadn't noticed Yui had followed him over. "I don't know," he said, and looked at Doc. "She'll tell you when we get there. Come on." He gently took Terry by the shoulder and led him toward the lunchroom exit. "What about Yui?" Doc looked back at her, still standing by the other teachers, looking confused and afraid. He glanced down at Terry, then back at her. "Say goodbye," he said, quickly. Terry went over to Yui, not knowing what to say. He finally settled on, "See you soon." "What's going on?" she asked again. Her eyes were shining with unshed tears. "Why won't anyone tell us?" "I don't know," he said. "I'll call you as soon as I know." He held up his phone. She took hers out and nodded. "As soon as you do." "Yes," he said, "promise." Before he knew what to say, she grabbed him and hugged him. Doc's strong hands gently took him and pulled him back. Yui's lips brushed his cheek so gently he wasn't sure it had really happened. Doc led him to the door, and he looked back. The image of her standing there, tears now streaming down her cheeks, was etched in his mind's eye like a laser-cut image. Outside, Doc took him to the teacher's parking lot, and they got into his old 2016 Ford pickup. He'd bragged about it the one other time Terry had ridden in it. "No damned auto drive, just like I prefer." After making sure Terry was buckled in, Doc fired up the engine and pulled out of the parking lot, heading down the coastal road faster than Terry thought was safe. As they approached the Institute, he cut off the main road and up away from the beach. "Where are we going?" Terry asked. "Up to the employee parking lot." "That's the next road down." "Only if you use the road." Terry was about to ask him what he meant when Doc slowed down. He turned off the road and right through somebody's immaculately tended front yard. Terry let out an uncomplimentary squeak and grabbed the bar mounted to the dashboard. Doc called it the Jesus bar, and for the first time, Terry knew why. The truck bounced over a hedge and onto a small dirt road. Doc drove the truck with casual confidence, managing to impress Terry despite the terror from the ride. He no longer had any idea where he was until the dirt road turned and he was looking down on the Institute. He'd looked up behind the buildings many times and had never realized there was a road on the rocky hill. The same ship he'd seen landing just minutes ago was squatting on the charred concrete like a big beetle. "Hang on," Doc said, and turned off the dirt road. "Oh, shit," Terry said, afraid Doc was going to jump down to the parking lot 30 meters below. Instead, there was another dirt road, or maybe more like a goat path? Either way, the already nerve-wracking ride became terrifying. Terry held the Jesus bar like his life depended on it, which he was afraid it did. Then they were skidding to a stop next to the Institute's perimeter fence, and Doc bailed out. "Come on, young man," he said. Terry unpeeled his fingers from the bar, his hands hurting from the force he'd been exerting. He unbuckled and got out of the truck. By the time he'd come around to the front, Doc already had a big section of fence pulled back to reveal an opening large enough for both of them. "What about your truck?" "Don't worry about it," Doc said, and gently urged Terry through the hole. Somewhere during the drive, Doc had put on a headset, which he was talking into. "I have him. We're north of the lot. Don't lift off. I repeat, don't lift off." He turned to Terry. "Come on, we need to hurry." He took Terry's hand and ran. Terry wanted to know why they needed to run, but just concentrated on keeping up with the man's much longer strides. In a short time, they were on the concrete, and the ship loomed above them like a building with rocket engines and landing legs. Terry wanted to gawk and ask a million questions. In every place the previous ships had landed, the concrete was charred into a series of small craters. He tried to imagine how hot those rockets must be to melt concrete. Where the ship sat at the moment were 6 smoldering burn spots. "Holy cow," he thought. They ran past the ship toward the Institute. As they passed to the other side, Terry saw a big tracked machine moving from the bay door at the back of the main aquarium building. It wasn't going more than a slow, walking pace and was being followed by a dozen of the Institute's staff. None so much as looked up as Doc and he ran by. They were far too intent on the vehicle. It reminded Terry of a gas tanker. At the back door, his mother was standing with one of the alien slates and all the senior science staff. Here, more staff were moving dollies packed high with all manner of crates. They went by just like the earlier staff, not noticing Terry or Doc and intent on their tasks. "Mom," Terry said when he saw her. "Oh, Terry," she said, and disengaged from the staff. They looked annoyed as she limped toward him. Terry noticed she was using her cane, a sure sign she'd been on her feet all day and was tired. She pulled him into an embrace. "Doc, thanks so much." "My pleasure, Madison," he said. "Mom, what the heck is going on?" "The High Court's going to rule in a few hours," she explained, putting a hand on both shoulders. "They want to euthanize the cetaceans." Terry's eyes widened in shock and horror. "Kill them?" His mom nodded her head. "But why?" Dr. Trudeau managed to successfully argue that the modified cetaceans' quality of life was sufficiently damaged and they were a danger. "A danger?" Terry demanded. "How? They're just dolphins." "I know it and you know it, but a lot of people fear the cult, the Abyss followers. They've attacked advocates of our cause." "How does that mean the cetaceans are hurting anyone?" "To us, it doesn't," she said, "but to the lawyers, it was a weapon to use against us in arguments." "It just isn't fair," Terry insisted. "We need to do something." "We are," his mother agreed. "Come inside and I'll show you." They went into the main building, and Terry looked at the nearest orca tank. It was empty, with no sign of the huge whales anywhere. "You're hiding them," he said with an ear-to-ear grin. His mother looked at Doc, then back at him. "Aren't you?" "Yeah, kid," Doc said. "Somewhere they'll never find them." "Where?" "We'll explain when we get there," his mother said. "I get to go?" "Absolutely." She looked at the boxes going by. "Can you go inside and get your stuff together? I left a crate in your bedroom. Only what fits, understand?" "Why can't I take everything?" She and Doc exchanged the same look. Doc shrugged. "We don't have time. The court will realize any moment now what we're doing, and they might send the police." "We're breaking the law?" Terry asked in a hushed tone. "Yeah," his mother said, and nodded. "But it's an immoral law that would mandate the cetacean's death because of what your father did." Terry's face darkened, and she shook her head. "Doc, can you take him up to the apartment?" "Sure," he said. "Come on, kiddo, I'll lend a hand." They went to the elevator. The doors opened just as they arrived, and 4 people came out with carts piled high. Terry saw everything from file boxes to specimen vials. They were emptying the labs upstairs. Doc walked in front of him up to the residence wing, reaching the apartment first, and keyed open the door. Terry went straight to his room, and just like his mother had said, there was a plastic case sitting on the floor. It was about 1 meter long, half a meter wide, and more than half a meter tall. It wasn't big enough to hold all his clothes, not to mention everything else. "I'll never get everything in there," he said. "Don't worry about it," Doc said. "Just get the important stuff." "Like what? Underwear and video games?" Terry laughed, and Doc went over to open the case. Terry saw his name with some more information printed on a removable label. He wanted to know what was on it. "No time, just pack. I'll help. I have lots of experience." "How?" Terry asked, pulling open a drawer in his clothes chest. "When you're a Navy SEAL, you move all the time, usually with no notice. We always kept the vital stuff in a duffel we called our go bag. A lot of the guys on the teams never unpacked." "They lived out of their go bags all the time?" Doc nodded. "That had to suck." "All a matter of perspective, I guess." Doc helped him sort by making piles of what he thought was important to Terry. He was right much more often than he was wrong. "You and Yui are really good friends," he said, not so much a question as a statement of fact. "Yeah, she's my best friend." Terry tossed aside a pair of slacks and took jeans instead. "We were friends almost from the time we met in grade school." He stopped and thought. She's just cool, and we get along great. Doc nodded, but didn't comment. He handed Terry a pile of thin sweats. It's hardly ever cold enough for those, Terry complained. It's almost summer, too. You'll want them where we're going, Doc said. Terry smiled and thought, so we're going somewhere cold. He was excited about seeing someplace new and being with the cetaceans. There'd be some great stories to tell Yui when he got back. Doc put his hand to his ear over the headset. Ship's taking off. Can I watch? Doc looked at his watch, then nodded. For a minute. Terry dropped the sweats in the case and ran out to the living room. The big window overlooked the ocean, but two smaller ones to the rear overlooked the tanks and the parking lot somewhat. He was disappointed he couldn't see the ship, but then the ground shook and the building rumbled as he covered his ears against the intense roar. Outside, the beetle-like ship climbed into view, riding on 6 brilliant columns of pure blue fire. It was incredible. I'm going to get to ride on one of those? You betcha, Doc said behind him. Outside, the ship climbed into the sky, and the roar slowly dissipated. Terry lost view of the ship in the small window. Come on, let's get back to it. He somehow managed to get the case filled. In the end, Doc and he both had to sit on it and latch the locks with their feet. Terry laughed uncontrollably as the drama played out. He only managed because Doc said he could take his school backpack too, which he stuffed with books, games, and his tablet computer. At the last minute, Doc took his dive computer, which Terry had left on the room's desk, and put it in the backpack. I won't have a chance to use it, will I? You never know, Doc said. They traveled down the elevator just in time for Terry to watch the big tank vehicle loading the bottlenoses, one after another, into its interior using an amazing flexible plastic tube with metal articulations. For their part, the dolphins appeared to be having the time of their lives. His mother was still in the same place, by the doors outside the employee parking lot. Only now there were more people. A lot more people. There were men and women he'd never seen before, along with children, too. Many wore grim expressions, and the children looked confused or scared. A little bit of it began to rub off on Terry. Everything will be fine, Doc said, noticing his expression. Your mom planned ahead. She knew this would happen? More like a contingency plan. You know what that means. He nodded. Who are all these other people? Family and friends of the staff, Doc said. Also some supporters who helped financially. He looked up and shielded his eyes. Here comes the last one. A brilliant flash of light was falling toward them from the sky, its engines blinking as it maneuvered. Terry watched it come, marveling at how such a huge thing could fall all the way from space with seeming ease. Doc put his hand to his ear again. Madison, he yelled. She spun around, attentive. A flyer is coming from Honolulu where a suborbital just landed. They figured it out, Terry's mom said. Everyone, ready to go. Doc, can your friends buy us some time? Doc's mouth was a thin line, but he nodded his head. He spoke into the tiny microphone by his mouth, too quietly for Terry to hear, then aloud to Terry's mom. They want to come along afterward. Are they sure? Yes. What about their families? None of them have wives or kids. That's why they came. Okay, but they better hurry. The rest of the conversation was drowned out as the ship's engines roared to full power, burning off velocity. Terry saw it was coming in to the side over the water and only began to slip sideways toward the Institute after it had nearly slowed to a stop. He wondered if that was on purpose. Before he could ask anyone, it flew over the parking lot and landed on 4 columns of fire. This ship was different. It was more boxy looking. The engine roar rose to an intolerable volume, and Terry again covered his ears. The blast from the rockets blew debris everywhere, and the wind was strong enough to push him back, even 100 yards away. As its big, thick landing legs pistoned to bear its weight on the ruined concrete, Terry saw riding on the side near a big glass cockpit, USS Teddy Roosevelt. As soon as the gear touched down, the engines cut out with a quickly reducing whine, and people raced into motion. Terry was swept along with the first group as Doc easily carried the case they'd packed together. He could hear voices yelling, children crying, the motors of the dolphin transport whining, and the distant sounds of gunfire. His eyes were as wide as dinner plates as he half walked and was half carried by Doc across the now crunchy concrete. The closer he got to the ship, the bigger it seemed. It looked like a flying aircraft carrier to his untrained eyes. He wondered why it looked so much different than the beetle-shaped one earlier. His young mind wanted to ask 1,000 questions, but there was no time. 2 ramps had lowered from the Teddy Roosevelt, one from under the front and another much larger one under its rear. The dolphin transport was rumbling toward the rear one. Terry was at the front of a steady stream flowing up the front ramp. Take care of him, Doc, his mother asked. You bet, Doc said, and guided Terry to a ladder and up several decks. The inside of the ship looked nothing like the sci-fi shows Terry had seen. It was rough, dirty, and there was rust in places. Nothing was white or padded. What a dump, he thought. A pair of crew members passed them, going down, while Terry and Doc went up. They looked just as dirty and rough as their ship. Neither seemed to be wearing uniforms, just oily coveralls and ball caps which said USS Teddy Roosevelt. The logo on the hat was a fat guy with a big mustache riding a moose. "Here we are, Terry," Doc said as they arrived at a room with lots of seats. It didn't look like it usually had lots of seats. In fact, there was a man in the back busily clinking more to the floor. It appeared the floor was covered with places for them to be snapped into place. "I want to stay with you," he said to Doc. "No can do. I have to help outside." "I can help," Terry insisted. "Yes, you can, by staying right here and helping the younger kids coming up." As if Doc had conjured them, a bunch of kids were shepherded into the chamber. "Please." "Okay," Terry said. Doc nodded, set the crate by another door, and was gone in an instant. Terry grumbled, then saw a pair of young boys, twins maybe, who looked scared to death. "Hey, you guys want to play a game?" he asked, and fished out his game box. They looked skeptical, but came closer. Terry smiled at them, and they smiled back. In minutes, there was a crowd around him, and Terry at least felt like he was helping. He didn't know how much later it was when a crewman dropped in from the deck above and looked at the dozens of kids standing around in abject shock. "What the hell is going on here?" he gasped. "Keeping them entertained," Terry said. "We left in 1 minute!" He raised his voice to a low yell. "Get in a chair now!" The kids, being used to grown-ups getting excited, moved in response to the specific order. Well, most of them did. Terry looked at the seat design and instantly joined in, helping the kids closest to him. Other older boys and girls saw what he was doing, and they began helping others. The crewman quickly showed him how to flip the buckles so they couldn't be unhooked by the occupant, then went around corralling a few children barely old enough to be in school, bodily tucked them in chairs, and strapped them in. Just as Terry helped the last boy buckle in, an alarm began to blare. "Thanks," the crewman said, then pointed to one of the last empty seats. "Buckle in, Space Cadet." Terry threw the man a salute and got a smile in reply. He dropped into his seat and pulled the straps into place. "Lift ship!" someone yelled over the intercom. Just as he clicked the straps home, the world seemed to explode. Pure transcendent rage assaulted his senses. It was like being in a hurricane and an earthquake at the same time. He'd been in some fast boats and flown a number of times, so he'd felt acceleration. None of it was like what he felt at that moment. Something was sitting on his chest, crushing the air from his lungs. He thought he was screaming, then realized it was all the kids around him. Some in shock, some in stark, raving terror. His vision swam red, and he could see kids tearing at their restraints. The still functioning part of his brain now understood why the buckles on the restraints were reversible, so the person wearing them couldn't release them. He could barely breathe, and could only try to imagine what would happen if the children unlocked their straps and crashed to the floor. Is it ever going to end? Suddenly, the pressure began to fall away. His vision cleared, and he looked around. Some of the kids appeared to have passed out. The sound of the engine's roar was greatly diminished. The crewman, buckled in nearby, was using a computer tablet and glanced at his young charges. "When do we land?" Terry yelled at him. "Land?" the man asked, looking confused. "Yeah, when do we set down to hide the cetaceans?" "I don't know what you're talking about," the man said. "We're set to rendezvous with a hyperspace carrier in 18 hours. The horror on Terry's face must have registered with the man because he looked surprised. "Nobody told you we were leaving Sol?" "We can't," Terry said, his voice trailing off. The man looked sad, and Terry got mad. Then he remembered his last words to Yui. "I'll see you soon." In a panic, he grabbed his phone from his pocket and clicked on Yui's grinning face. Of course it was a satellite phone, but would it work in space? It took the phone forever, but it did eventually connect, and he heard a ring. "Terry?" Yui's voice spoke. It sounded distorted. "Yui, it's me. I'm sorry." "Terry, where are—" The call broke into static. "Saw ships taking. Police are everywhere. We're going to another star. They didn't tell me." "Star? Terry, you..." The phone disconnected. Yui! "Take it easy, kid," the crewman said. Terry stared at his phone in anguish, slowly letting it fall from his hand. It bounced off the floor and flew across the room, spinning lazily as it went. His tears didn't fall down his cheeks, instead forming puddles over his eyes. He was in space. Chapter 2. Approaching the Stargate, Sol System, July 1st, 2037. Terry didn't speak to Doc when he came to get him. The older man floated onto the deck, looked at the devastated expression on Terry's face, and simply unbuckled him. "Come on," Doc said. He gently took Terry by the arm and began moving him. Part of him marveled at zero gravity, but that part was crushed by his sense of loss. "Why didn't they tell me?" "I'm sure you're wondering why we didn't tell you," Doc said, as he helped Terry through a hatch and up down another deck. Terry had no idea where they were going. "Your mother was afraid you might end up in jail with everyone else when the government came for us." "What do you mean?" "Glad you're still with us," Doc said. Terry shrugged and almost hit a ladder. "Careful until you get used to this." Doc helped him get his own grip on the ladder before speaking again. The court not only ruled against allowing the whales to live, it also ruled everyone involved in the project was guilty of illegal modification of an endangered species. "I didn't do anything," Terry said. "No, but you helped take care of them. In the eyes of the law, that's enough." They were going to put me in jail? We don't know, Doc admitted. As a minor, probably not. But they would have put your mom in jail, and you'd have probably been tried as a minor. Might even have been sent to some sort of juvenile detention facility. He shrugged. So much of the new Earth Republic government is still unset. Nobody knows what would have happened to you. Your mom thought it better you come. Without asking me, he said darkly. No one thought about what would happen to my life. That's not fair, he said, and not true. She was always thinking of you. In fact, she was thinking of staying and fighting it out until we found out they were going to arrest you along with everyone else. Terry looked away, but couldn't let go of his feelings of betrayal. They continued moving through hatches and long companionways until they reached a dome with windows all around. The Earth was a sphere off to one side and looked no bigger than a basketball. Terry gasped at the view. I'm in space, he thought, the spectacle finally overcoming his anger. In the dome were all the Institute doctors, 3 strange people he'd never seen before, and his mom. I'm sorry, she said as soon as she saw him. There wasn't time. Doc explained, Terry said. She could see he wasn't happy and frowned. So you know we had to do it this way. No, I don't, he said. I'd have understood. Would you? She asked. Terry, you're mature for your age, but you're still a child. The truth is, a lot more people than just you and I were in danger of going to jail, maybe forever. I had to think about everyone. And the cetaceans, Dr. Orsage said. His mom nodded in agreement. We also thought you deserved to be here, Doc said. Terry looked around at the people and realized he was the only kid there. Everyone else was senior staff from the Institute, Doc, and some of the ship's crew. At least, he guessed that was who the 3 strange people were. Terry, his mother said, this is Captain Baker. She owns the Teddy Roosevelt. A woman with long gray hair pulled back was hanging onto a rail like she'd spent her life in space. She nodded to Terry and winked. He smiled despite himself. Glad to have you aboard, young man, she said. This is Commander Ed Moore. He's my XO. If you need something from me, he is usually who you'll talk to. The man she'd indicated was considerably younger than the captain looked, despite being bald. He smiled a big, natural smile and nodded to Terry as well. Lastly, meet Ensign Drake. He's my purser and will see to all the passengers, including you, en route. Drake was a young man and nodded at Terry with no smile. He had short-cut dark hair and sharp eyes. Terry was about to ask what their destination was when something outside caught his eye. They were approaching another ship. Terry grabbed a handle and moved closer to the window for a better look. He didn't know much about spaceships, though just about everyone on the planet would recognize this one, a long, cigar-shaped ship with a ring of modules around the blunt rear. Is that Pegasus? Yes, it is, Captain Baker said. Teddy and the other transports are catching a ride. My ship's capable, but she doesn't have her own hyperdrive. Pegasus, Terry said again. The famous ship of the Winged Hussars, one of the 4 horsemen. 11 years ago, they were the last of the Alpha Contract Mark companies to come back from deep space. Everyone had written them off for dead, but they came back, and in a different ship than the one they'd left with. Nobody knew much about the huge warship, only that it was incredibly powerful and rarely came back to Earth. Why are they helping? He asked. Your mom can explain better, Doc said. Well, the Hussars have helped us for years, his mom explained. They were the ones who arranged to move the bottlenoses and orcas from the parks where we found them. They were also the principal financial backer. Amelia Cromwell, who's married to the Hussars commander Lawrence Kosmalski, has been extremely helpful, though it was Colonel Kosmalski who volunteered to get us out this time. He just happened to be here when everything fell apart. Where are we going? Terry asked. All the adults looked at each other, but none of them answered right away. Eventually his mother replied, For now, we're riding with the Winged Hussars to a system called Karma. We'll wait there to see if this legal stuff can get sorted out. What about the cetaceans? He asked. You can see them after we dock with Pegasus, his mom said. She looked at the captain. We'll have a few hours before we go through the Stargate. Don't jump until 2200 Zulu, she said. Outside, Pegasus grew steadily closer. Docking with the Winged Hussars' huge warship turned out to be nothing special. A few minutes of bumps from the Teddy Roosevelt's maneuvering thrusters, followed by a jolt, and the PA announced they were docked. Terry realized he didn't know what Zulu time was after docking, but then a crewman helped him update his phone for the ship's network, and the time matched immediately. They had 3 hours. He spent the time in the observation dome, watching the proceedings in space. They were one of 4 ships docking with Pegasus, all of which had evacuated the Institute, cetaceans, and staff. He overheard one conversation his mom was having with the radio operator. Authorities on Earth were insisting they return to Earth immediately. Can they make us? Terry asked Doc. Pegasus is more powerful than all the spaceships Earth has, combined, he said. How do you know so much about this stuff? He asked Doc. I was a merc for a couple years, Doc said. Terry gawked. Yeah, I didn't tell anyone. I was with the Winged Hussars and helped them develop marine tactics. I thought Marines were for water and stuff. Doc laughed and smiled. These are Space Marines, more like SEALs in a lot of ways, but SEAL stands for Sea, Air, and Land. Sea, Air, Land, and Space? SEALs? Terry asked. Doc cocked his head and shrugged, making Terry laugh. Yeah, it doesn't work, does it? No, not really. And Space Marines have been talked about in science fiction. It was too cool a name to pass up, I guess. Anyway, I helped develop some tactics to defend ships from boarding and to board other ships. We trained doing some of that as SEALs. I spent some time with NASA learning zero-gravity maneuvering. He flipped around a couple times, looking like a gymnast. Afterward, I put it all together and then taught the Hussars. That is no kidding cool, Doc shrugged. Can you teach me some stuff? Like what? Doc asked, his mannerism suggesting suspicion. How to get around better in space, Terry said. Oh, sure. You don't feel sick at all? No, why? Doc nodded. A lot of people get sick in zero gravity. Terry thought about it. His stomach had felt funny since they'd reached orbit, but not sick. He'd figured it was because he missed Yui, and thinking about her took away some of the fun he'd been having. Doc saw his look and frowned. Let's go check on your dolphins. I'd rather see the orcas, he said. Doc nodded, and they set out together. As the two moved through Teddy Roosevelt, Terry watched how Doc moved and began to copy him. The former SEAL seemed to unconsciously plan every single move. He would soar from one handhold to another, often only touching the next handhold before gently pushing onward. It was a ballet. Terry couldn't do half as well. Still, he tried. Doc watched him as they proceeded, making suggestions and generally nodding in approval. All your diving and swimming translates. You're right, Terry said as he made a particularly good grab at a passing handhold. Then he missed the next one, and Doc had to snag him before he crashed into a wall. Well, kinda, they both laughed. You'll get better. They continued. Have you been on this ship before? Nope, Doc said. Then how do you know your way around? All ships are similar in many ways, Doc explained. This is a Kuiper class, the first human-made ships. I was on the Donald Trump shortly after it landed in 2031. The later iterations aren't as ugly as the first one, but it got the job done. They're working on a new class. Comal Tramp is the name. Those will be hyperspace capable. This ship is only 6 years old. He looked at the beat-up interior, the rust spots, bent ladder rungs, and other signs of neglect. This ship is more like 5, Doc corrected. Terry shook his head in amazement. This thing is trashed. It's a working ship, Doc said. I've been on a lot worse down on Earth. He swung around a corner and there was a big doorway. Here we are. The door said, Transfer lock number 2. One of the Teddy Roosevelt crew was manning the hatch and saw them approach. Going over to Pegasus? She asked. Yes, Doc said. This young man helps care for the whales. Oh, I see, she said, and pressed a button. A big door rumbled and rotated to the side, showing a tunnel to another door. Press the green button at the other end. I know the drill, Doc said. She nodded, and they pulled themselves through. At the far end, Doc pressed the green button, and the door rumbled back closed behind them. Terry felt his ears pop and put his hands up to them. Pressure between the two ships equalizing, Doc explained. The door in front of them moved aside much quicker and quieter than the other ship's lock. Inside stood a pair of men in black coveralls Terry realized was a uniform. Both wore ball caps, and there were red stripes down the outsides of their sleeves and legs. Welcome aboard the EMS Pegasus, one of them said, a man in his 40s. Then he looked closer at Doc and came more erect, not easy in zero gravity. Lieutenant Commander Abercrombie, sir. Good to see you again. Sergeant Teal, Doc said. Lieutenant Teal now, sir. Congrats, my friend, Doc said, then looked at Terry. This gentleman was a new recruit when I started training the Winged Hussars Marines. How has my training worked out? Great, sir, Lieutenant Teal said. We've had to make some changes, of course. We had a fight 2 months ago. A bunch of Zool tried boarding. They weren't expecting the hairless monkeys to be able to put up a fight. The man's teeth skinned back in a feral smile. They won't be expecting anything anymore. Glad to hear it, Doc said, then gave a little cough and glanced at Terry. This is Terry Clark, the son of Dr. Madison Clark, head of the science expedition. Hello, Terry, the Marine said. He introduced the Marine with him. I don't suppose you need directions. No, Doc said. Just tell me which docking port has which ship. Kavul Tesh is at Dock 2, and Kavul Otto is at Dock 3. Terry noted the one they'd come out of was Dock 1. Doc thanked his old student and set out. Right away, Terry noticed the interior of Pegasus was vastly different in every way from Teddy Roosevelt. Its corridors were rounded and smooth, the metal carefully painted and tended to. They also curved around the ship. Teddy Roosevelt was like being in a building. Everything had right angles. It somehow felt inhuman. Different kind of ship, right? Doc said, looking at him. Yeah, feels weird. It should, Doc said. Pegasus was made by aliens before humans learned the written word. Incredible, Terry said. It was only a rumor among people. Endless videos talked about the Four Horsemen, speculated, guessed, or sometimes made up stories. They all wanted to know how they survived and flourished. The most commonly speculated on rumors were about the Winged Hussars and the mysterious ship Pegasus. The most common rumor was they'd made it from parts. That it was entirely alien was not a commonly held belief. The hussars themselves didn't talk much, mainly because they weren't ever on Earth. Doc led them around the circular corridor. A door to the right said, "Lift number 2. The door opened. Inside was a woman and an alien who looked like a badger. Terry knew the race. They were called Kachkala. The human had gold stripes on her uniform, the Kachkala blue. They got out and moved back in the direction Terry and Doc had come from. A little further on, Terry saw 2 aliens working on an open panel. One was an El Shah, like he'd seen before. The other looked like a big anteater. They both wore clothing appropriate to their races, in black, just like the Marines, only these 2 had green stripes. The El Shah moved an eye to track them as they went by. The other didn't seem to notice. "How many aliens are in the Hussars' crew?" he asked Doc. "A lot," Doc replied. "They have to be at least half human, according to the Merc Guild, so less than half." They walked past one of the other locks. This one was unguarded, with a ramp going up and a ramp going down, and finally another lock's sign said number 3. A pair of Marines saluted and opened the door. "This is one of the ships holding your orcas," Doc said, and went inside. "Why do they always keep the locks closed?" Terry asked. "Warship," Doc said. "It's protocol." "But this is Earth. Aren't we safe?" "Nowhere in the universe is safe," Doc said. Terry wondered why he would say such a thing, then realized Doc had been a merc and lost friends in the Alpha contracts. He guessed Doc would know as well as anyone else. The inside lock opened, and they entered the other ship. Kavul Otto, the Marine lieutenant had called it. Its interior looked strange, like Pegasus, but different. The curves of the corridors were more unusual, as if whoever had designed it hadn't had a plan and had just wanted to build something. Doc wasn't as familiar with this ship. He stopped the first crewman they encountered, a woman with short brown hair and bright green eyes. "Where are the whales?" he asked her. "Main hold," she said. 2 companionways over there. You'll see signs." "Thanks," Doc said, as they floated in the indicated direction. It was a good thing there were signs, or they never would have found it. "Who made this ship?" Terry asked. "Some aliens," Doc said. "No clue which ones." "Why are humans using alien ships anyway?" "Because we're still figuring out how to make our own," Doc said. The corridor opened through a big hatch into the hold. Inside, a massive glass wall had been installed, and the space was completely filled with water. 4 orcas floated inside, so Terry knew it was the shore pod even before he recognized Cray. Terry was about to ask what was on their heads, but he figured it out. A glass dome with machinery integrated into its rim was somehow stuck to the orcas' heads. There was no air in the tank, but since there was no gravity, it wouldn't have mattered. Terry understood. Without gravity, the air wouldn't form a surface. It would just float around the water in bubbles. The apparatus on their head was a rebreather, related to the device Doc had brought them to dive with the previous year. "Hello, shore pod," Terry said. The 4 orcas lazily moved over to the tank wall and looked at him with their huge eyes. "Warden Terry," Cray said. "You in dark. Shore in dark." Terry looked around. The hold was well lit. "It's not dark, Cray." "Is dark," Cray said. "Is all dark," Ulybka said. "Beyond." All 4 orcas turned to face in different directions. "In space," Doc said. "They mean in space." "How do they know they're in space?" Terry wondered aloud. The orcas didn't answer. All right, friends, that is the end of Part 2, Chapter 2, which is where we're going to stop for today. We appreciate you taking your time to listen to us, and if you liked what you heard today, please give us a thumbs up, a like, and subscribe to the channel, and share with your friends. We'll see you again in a few days.